Scott Shapiro is with us today, courtesy of Liz and Kent Ernest. Scott teaches both law and philosophy at Yale Law School, where he directs the Center for Law and Philosophy. He earned his bachelor's and doctorate degrees in philosophy from Columbia and then a JD from Yale Law School. He's the author of Legality and editor of the Oxford Handbook of Jurisprudence and Philosophy of Law, one of my favorites. Please give a warm welcome to Scott Shapiro.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Yeah. First of all, I have Yankee blood, so I brought a jacket, but it was just too hot for me. Although it is snowing in New York, so I'm enjoying being overheated. Well, so our book, The Internationalists, is the story of the modern international order. It's about the people who helped to build it and why, despite its imperfections, it's crucial that it be defended now more than ever. The central argument of the book is that the origins of the modern world order can be traced to a specific date in history, August 27th, 1928, when the world leaders gathered together in Paris to outlaw war. Now, the treaty that was signed on that date, which goes by the name the Kellogg-Briand Pact, Kellogg for Frank Kellogg, the American Secretary of State, and Briand, Aristide Briand, the French foreign minister, has largely been forgotten. I'm just curious, show of hands, who's ever heard of the Kellogg-Briand Pact? Wow, that is a lot of people. That is much more, Savannah, very educated. Most people have never heard about it, actually, most law professors have never heard of it. And the people who have heard of it think it's among the most ridiculous things that diplomats have ever tried to do. The idea that you could end war by signing a piece of paper strikes many people as the height of foolishness. And to tell you the truth, when my colleague Ona Hathaway and I taught international law at Yale before we wrote the book, we also treated it that way, as a laughingstock and obviously a failed experiment in idealism. However, through the course of research on a related topic, though at the time we didn't know it was related, the history of economic sanctions, we discovered something we really didn't expect. That is, far from being ridiculous, outlawing war turned out to be transformative. It represented, if you will, a hinge in history where one world order ended and another began. In short, before 1928, war was the legitimate mechanism of statecraft. It was the way in which states enforced their rights against one another. In fact, and this is what we found absolutely astonishing, before 1928, war was legal, but economic sanctions were illegal. After 1928, this switches, and it switches incredibly quickly. War becomes illegitimate, indeed criminal, and economic sanctions are now the routine way in which international law is enforced throughout the world. Now, we describe this tectonic shift in world history narratively in the book through a cast of characters that we call the Internationalists. Now, most of these people we had never heard of. In fact, one of the main heroes of the book, who I'll talk about later, did not, before the book, have a Wikipedia entry, which in the modern world means you don't exist. But we were really taken by their determination, their brilliance, their vision, their doggedness, and indeed their canniness in being able to figure out how to take their ideas and turn them into action. In a time where people are talking and thinking about resistance, their story we found to be inspirational. Now, one of the reasons I think that most people think that war, I turned on my phone just because I realized I didn't know how long things were going, and then my sister just texted me, "I'm watching you." So, hi, Melissa. Okay, it's funny. Okay, yeah. Okay, so I think the reason why most people think that outlawing war is ridiculous, an absurd thing to do, is because they don't appreciate the vital role that war used to play before 1928 in an era which we call the Old World Order. In the Old World Order, states had the right of war. Now, today, we think, of course, of war as the consummate breakdown of the system. In the Old World Order, war was the system. If a state had been wronged and made demands of reparation, and those demands were ignored, the state who had been injured had the legal right to use force in order to right that wrong. Now, they had that right not just in cases, what we recognize today, of self-defense, of invasion, but any kind of legal wrong whatsoever, to collect debts, to recover property, to enforce commercial treaties, any reason you could go to court, you could go to war for. Now, this may sound like an absolutely crazy thing to do, barbaric to go to war to collect debts. But from their perspective, in the Old World Order, it made perfect sense. If somebody owes you money, what do? You go to a lawyer, sue the person, go to court. If the person doesn't pay up, the sheriff, will execute the judgment. If you're a state, however, you're sovereign, so you don't recognize any higher authority. You don't have anyone to go to. There's no Supreme Court of the world. There are no world police that you can appeal to. And so states thought, and the law gave them the right to use force in order to right the wrong. Now, what is critical here is not just that states had the right of war. They had many other rights which gave the right of war value. Now, the most important right that they had, which supported the right of war, was the right of conquest. Now, we know that conquest has happened for millennia. What many people don't realize is that conquest was a legal right. And it was a legal right because the law needed to give states a way of actually righting the wrongs that they went to war in order to right. When the United States went to war with Mexico in 1846, the official legal justification was that Mexico owed the United States $2 million. The United States tried for 20 years to get that money back and decided to go to war in 1846. And as compensation, they got compensation for those debts. And the name of that compensation is California, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, part of Oklahoma, and basically 500,000 square miles of Mexican territory. Now, this is not the way, when the United States did this, it was not acting as a rogue imperial power, it was acting as what responsible states did. And that is because the Old World Order gave states the right of war and therefore the right of conquest. In addition to the right of conquest, states had another right. If they had the right to go to war, they had the right to threaten to go to war. Now, this is incredibly important because this undergirds the practice that we now call gunboat diplomacy. Now, as many of you know, in the 19th century, Japan was secluded and excluded with the exception of the Dutch, twice a year from trading with Japan. The United States and other Western powers were very upset. They claimed that Japan was violating its legal obligation to engage in global commerce and sent Matthew Perry and his gunboats into Edo Bay, now Tokyo Bay, threatening to destroy the port unless the Japanese signed a treaty of friendship. The Japanese quickly became friends with the United States and the other Western countries. These treaties were binding in the Old World Order, and in fact, to violate them would have been a cause of war. Because war was legal, another consequence followed. Immunity to prosecution. If war is legal, waging war cannot be criminal. And that is why, before 1928, no head of state or military leader was ever prosecuted for waging an aggressive war. Napoleon goes to war with virtually every state in Europe, kills 5 to 7 million people. And what is his punishment? He gets an island in the Mediterranean called Elba, of which he is the emperor. Now, of course, it is a demotion to go from emperor of France to emperor of Elba, but hardly the punishment you would give somebody who killed 5 to 7 million people. At the end of World War I, the victors in the Treaty of Versailles pledged to indict Kaiser Wilhelm II for waging an aggressive war. Wilhelm flees to the Netherlands. The Netherlands will not give up Wilhelm on the theory that he did nothing wrong. That is, that it is not legal to prosecute somebody for engaging in legal activity. Finally, because states had the legal right of war, neutral states, that is states who weren't in the war, were under a strict duty of impartiality. That's what lawyers called it, a strict duty of impartiality. Meaning that if they were to favor one side over another, that would be an act of war. I don't know how many here have seen Hamilton or heard the soundtrack of Hamilton. The Cabinet Battle 2 is all about this duty of neutrality. There, the United States did not want to favor France in its war with Great Britain on the theory that if it favored one side over another, it would be an act of war and would draw the United States into a war with the European powers, which it did not want to get drawn into. So now the thing is, I normally give this talk with a PowerPoint, it has pictures and diagrams and cool animation. It's very helpful to see how the old world order changes. But they said if you wanted to be on TV, you couldn't have the PowerPoint. And so I was thinking, do I want to give a good talk and not be on TV? Or a lousy talk and be on TV? Hi, Mom. Anyway, what you would have seen is a slide that has in the center, it says right of war, and there would have been 4 circles emanating from it. One would have said right of conquest, the other one would have said right of gunboat diplomacy, and below you would have seen immunity to prosecution for war, and finally duties of impartiality. Now the duties of impartiality are really important because that was what prevented neutrals from imposing economic sanctions on belligerents. You know, things that we do every day now were violations of the laws of war. So that's what you would have seen. Okay, now I've been describing this very abstractly, but the book is called The Internationalists, and it's really about people. And one of the most important people in the book, the guy who does not have his own, who did not have his own Wikipedia entry, is this man named Salmon Levinson. Now, Salmon Levinson was a Jewish bankruptcy attorney from Chicago. And he was a son of German immigrants. He became a successful lawyer doing corporate reorganizations for Sears, with railroad companies, steel companies, and really never thought about international relations at all until World War I happened and the stock market shut down for the third time in its history. He also had two fighting-age sons. And he started thinking about the legality of war, thinking how foolish this is that we allow states to resolve their conflicts by essentially getting them to kill each other. Now, I don't know how many lawyers are out there, but I think it's really significant that Salmon Levinson was a bankruptcy attorney, because bankruptcy attorneys hate litigators. Litigators fight it out. They make a bad situation worse, whereas the bankruptcy attorney tries to make a bad situation better. Let's all get in the room, let's work it out, let's not fight to the death. And also, he's a bankruptcy attorney. He's not an international lawyer, so he doesn't really appreciate the fact that this is the way the world has always been. I mean, he knows it, but it's not like baked into his DNA. And so he imagines a different world. And it turns out that through his wife, he was close friends with the great American philosopher John Dewey. And Dewey helped him develop his thoughts on the outlawry of war, how to make law illegal. And Levinson starts to make contacts with important politicians, and in particular Senator Borer, the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. It's a long story from 1917 to 1928, which we tell in the book, and I won't go into it now, but through incredible dogged determination, Levinson was able to bootstrap a global social organization which pays off on August 27th, 1928, when the 15 most powerful nations, United States, Germany, Italy, France, Japan, China, they meet in Paris in the Quai d'Orsay to outlaw war. And right after that, within the year, virtually every state in the world signed on to it, renouncing war. And it was at the time the most subscribed to treaty in history. So it was really an amazing achievement that Levinson, though Levinson obviously didn't work alone, he worked with other characters that we describe in the book. He got the world to do something momentous. Now, it was so momentous that it was dangerous. Why? What the Kellogg-Briand Pact did, remember, I just spent the first 12 minutes or so of this talk describing how the world operated according to the rules that presupposed the legality of war. Now, all of a sudden, like they had taken out the linchpin of that system. They had taken out the center. They had now said that all the rules that states you followed, which depended on the right of war, you no longer have that right. And this caused an enormous problem. The first problem that arises befalls the successor to Frank Kellogg of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, the Secretary of State Henry Stimson. In September of 1931, Japan invades Manchuria and eventually conquers Manchuria. Manchuria is enormous. It's 1.5 million square kilometers. It's like an enormous piece of the earth. Japan had just signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact 3 years earlier. Why they did that is a whole other story, which we talk about in the book. It's a really interesting story, why they thought they were allowed to do that, but they did it. And that caused an enormous problem for the world, which was, what do we do about this? Like, how do we enforce the prohibition against war? We just renounced war. It would be absurd to use war to enforce the prohibition on war. And I feel like it's like a Homer Simpson moment where they go, oh. Like they threw out the one tool they had. And then they had to think, well, what tools do we have in order to discipline states who do go to war and violate their commitments? Now, Henry Stimson went to Yale College, and it just so happens he was the classmate of Salmon Levinson. And Levinson had written an article in 1929, which he sent to Stimson. And in that article, which was entitled The Sanctions of Peace, he proposed that now that war was illegal, states should no longer have the right of conquest. Right? If the whole idea of conquest was it was to further the state's right of war, if states no longer had the right of war, they should no longer have the right of conquest. Now, of course, people would engage in conquest, Levinson recognized, but what other states should not do is recognize that conquest. They should not trade with them. They should not accord any sovereign rights to the conqueror. As Levinson said, somebody might take a city, but that city would no longer be his. Stimson takes up this idea and then writes the famous Stimson Note, which became the famous Stimson Doctrine. And in the Stimson Doctrine, he said it was now the policy of the United States that they would no longer recognize conquests. In fact, they would no longer recognize treaties that were coerced. Now, and then the League of Nations, all the members of the League of Nations also adopt this. Now, this is an unbelievable revolution in the way the world works. Within 4 years of signing this piece of paper, virtually the entire world renounces what hitherto had been one of the most ancient rights of sovereignty, that is conquest. So just to read you the Stimson Note, it says, the U.S. does not intend to recognize any situation, treaty, or agreement which may be brought about by means contrary to the covenants and obligations of the Pact of Paris of August 27, 1928. That Pact of Paris is the Kellogg-Briand Pact. So, and the League of Nations agrees that signing the Pact of Paris means that states cannot conquer one another. So if you ever wonder why, like, nobody recognizes Russia's invasion of Crimea, it's this. It begins in 1932, right after 1928, and the reason that is given is because of the outlawry of war. Now, this not only gets rid of the right of conquest, but also the right of gunboat diplomacy, right? Because if you can't go to war, you can't threaten to go to war and get the agreement you want. Next order of business is this neutrality thing that I talked about, that is the duties of impartiality. In the run-up to World War II, and when World War II begins, before the United States is in the war, a big problem faces the United States, which is how do we aid Great Britain and not Germany and not commit an act of war? Because remember, to help one belligerent over another was illegal, and that would be committing an act of war, and many isolationists in the United States did not want America drawn into the war. It was then, in the beginning of 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, that the United States adopted the position that the Pact of Paris, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, changed the strict duties of neutrality, meaning that now, because states don't have the right of war, neutral states aren't interfering with their rights by siding with their opponents over them, because they're not trampling on the right of war because they don't have the right of war. No one has the right of war anymore, except in cases of self-defense. Now, this is incredible, I think, because first of all, it's the beginning of this practice of economic sanctions that we just take for granted, and it happens now because of the Kellogg-Briand Pact. But it also happened 6 months before Pearl Harbor. The reason that the Japanese attacked the United States in Pearl Harbor was because we imposed economic sanctions on them, which by the old rules would have been a reason to attack the United States. Now, the United States only changed its mind about what neutral states were allowed to do 6 months before the attack. So really what you have here, what World War II becomes, is a clash over world orders. It's a war over war. Now, after the Allies win the war, the question becomes, what do we do about it? What do we do with the Nazis and Imperial Japan who waged this aggressive war? Can we prosecute them? Now, the claim became, and it's a long story which we tell in the book, Nuremberg is the trial in which the main charge is the charge of violating the Kellogg-Briand Pact. We think of Nuremberg as the trial in which or trials in which the Nazi leaders were convicted, prosecuted and then convicted of perpetrating the Holocaust. That was not the reason why these trials were I don't want to say staged, but were established. Okay? They were established to try the Nazis for waging aggressive war, and the American officials were able to shoehorn the charges of the Holocaust into Nuremberg simply by saying that the Holocaust was related to aggressive war. So the crimes against humanity, the real legal the real legal reason for that is the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and it's in. I mean, if you Google it, you'll see it's in the indictment. It's talked about extensively in the trial transcripts. What we see, and if I had the PowerPoint, like the animation would have blown you away. So you're just going to have to believe me on this one. So remember I had said that there was this slide where you have in the middle the right of war, and then conquest, gunboat diplomacy, immunity prosecution, and no economic sanctions, and then the animation would have gone shoo, and you would have seen this new slide, which we call the New World Order, where you have a prohibition on war, no conquest, no gunboat diplomacy, crime of aggression, and then finally the possibility of economic sanctions. What you do is you see an entire international system flip on its ear in a very, very short time because of this piece of paper signed in 1928. Now, again, it doesn't happen all at once. They really don't know what when they sign it in 1928, they don't know what they're doing. It's like, to give the Obamacare analogy, what if Congress had repealed Obamacare but not replaced it, right? There would have been chaos, and it would have taken a long time to put this thing together. Now, this is not just the healthcare system of the United States. This is the international system involving all the states of the world. So it's a really complex, messy process, but which is precipitated on that day, August 27th, 1928. Now, the last part of the book, we map out the New World Order, and I'm going to talk about it very briefly, but one of the things that Ona and I wanted to do was we wanted to see whether the change in the rules mattered, like on the ground. And so there's a lot of statistical evidence in the book, a lot of quantitative evidence. What we did was we went through all the territorial acquisitions data from the Correlates of War data set, which is the largest and most comprehensive data set involving war. And we tracked basically the practice of conquest from 1816 to 2014. And this is what we found. Much to, I mean, luckily, it turned out this way, but we were kind of shocked at the magnitude of the effect, both in terms of size and both in terms of frequency and size. So it turns out that from 1816 to 1928, and 1816 is just where the data starts, so that's why we started there. From 1816 to 1928, the average state could expect to suffer a conquest once in 40 years. Afterwards, a state could expect, the average state could expect to suffer a conquest once or twice in 1,000 years. Now, to put that in human terms, that means if you lived before 1928, the odds that you lived in a state that would be conquered would be once in your lifetime. And now, it's once or twice a millennium. So it's been an enormous change in terms of the frequency. But in terms of the extent is really striking. The average before 1928 was per year of amount territory conquered is 248,000 square kilometers, roughly 11 Crimeas. Like if you take Crimea and you multiply it by 11, you'll get the average amount conquered per year. Now, after 1945, you get roughly 1 Crimea every 4 years. So you got from 11 Crimeas a year to 1 Crimea every 4 years, which, and the last Crimea was Crimea. That's why Crimea matters a great deal, because it's, if you will, the exception that proves the rule. It's such a rarity now. Basically, conquest has fallen off in terms of extent, 96%, and it needs to stay that way. It needs to stay that way, and the way in which it stays that way is that the acquisition by Russia of Crimea cannot be recognized. The sanctions cannot be dropped. It is horrible for the people of Crimea, but it is really important for the health of the international system. Because states cannot be conquered, we see a proliferation of states. So after 1945, you have about 60 states. Now there's roughly 193 states. And the reason is that states can be small and weak. South Sudan broke away from Sudan, even though it makes it more vulnerable in one sense, but not vulnerable in another way. It doesn't really have to worry about being conquered and have its oil deposits taken, because nobody will recognize that conquest. Now, this is wonderful on one hand. Weak states can survive, but it has its downside. And there's a downside to the New World Order, which we talk about in the book, which is that if weak states can survive, so can failed states. And failed states are breeding grounds for terrorism and for insurgencies that don't respect national borders. So on the one hand, the outlawry of war between states has virtually, not completely, virtually eliminated interstate war. But if anything, it has created pressures towards intrastate wars. And the wars that we're seeing nowadays are largely civil wars brought about by the fact that states don't need to be strong in order to survive. Now, I'm going to conclude just by saying, like, there's just a lot of data in the book. There's a lot of ideas in the book, a lot of philosophical ideas, but at the end, it's a book about people. It's about people who most of us have never heard of, who were courageous. They were ordinary people with extraordinary ideas, and they were able to change the world. And that I hope it's an inspiration for all of us that it's possible for us to have agency in the world as well. Thank you.
Hi, that was wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
The timing of this obviously is striking between World War I and World War II, but I'm also curious whether technology, how much it had to do with it. So we went from hand-to-hand combat, soldiers just stab each other one at a time, to shooting at each other, and we are at this point acquiring the ability to wipe out thousands of people at a go. We've got airplanes, we've got bombs, we're moving toward the atomic bomb. So did that factor into their thinking and the urgency with which they wanted to do this?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Let me say, so sometimes, you know, you think, well, the outlawry of war was the result of World War I, which if there was ever, I mean, most wars are stupid. It would just tell you the truth. World War I was a particularly stupid war, a terrible, terrible waste of life. But it wasn't merely the fact that so many people died, it's how they died. The invention of poison gas, of earlier the Gatling gun, which enabled there to be automatic fire, the increase in tonnage of armament made war even more ghastly than it had been before. But, and here's what I find amazing, the response after World War I in the League of Nations was not to outlaw war. The League of Nations, in the Covenant of the League of Nations, allows states to go to war. It just says that if you're going to go to war, come to us first. And if you come to us first, let us adjudicate your dispute, but you don't actually have to listen to us. You just have to wait 60 days. Then you can go to war, even if you lose. So it is actually amazing to me that after the cataclysm of World War I, the response was, well, let's just have war, but just wait 60 days, which is an enormous failure of imagination, but it also shows how deeply ingrained the idea of the right to wage war was among diplomats. Now, for sure, with the failure of the League of Nations, this gives energy to anti-war activists to try something else, precisely because with the change in technology, war is getting worse. But it wasn't obvious. And one of the things that the book tells, and it's a paradoxical way to put the message of the book, which is outlawing war is an opportunity, but a problem. How do we live without war? How do we solve our problems if states don't have the right to use force against one another? And we've gotten really, really, really good at that. The Iran nuclear deal is a perfect example of avoiding war, though I'm sad to say that the current administration seems to be forgetting this lesson and is backsliding. And in some sense, the message of the book is not to backslide.
Within the context of the pact, what was the U.S. justification for the Gulf War and war against Iraq and subsequently Afghanistan?
Yeah, so good. Those are great questions. So the pact is just one I mean, it's 2 paragraphs, but it's really one operative paragraph. And it really doesn't say much. It actually fits on the back of a postcard. I actually have one of those postcards. You can get them off of eBay. And it basically just, it says the high contracting parties hereby renounce war as a solution to international controversies. It doesn't say anything about self-defense. It doesn't say anything about anything. It's very vague. The person who wrote the Kellogg-Briand Pact, a medieval historian named James Shotwell at Columbia University, also wrote the first draft of the United Nations Charter. It's one thing we found in the archives. And the UN Charter begins with, I mean, the first draft of it begins with the Kellogg-Briand Pact. So the Kellogg-Briand Pact survives in the form of the UN Charter. Now, the UN Charter lays down basically 3 exceptions to war. One is the prohibition on war. So the 3 reasons you're allowed to go to war. One is self-defense after due to an armed attack, which I'll get to in a second. But the second thing is the consent. The state allows you to go to war with it. And number 3, the Security Council authorization. So the Security Council authorizes the use of force. Now, in the case of Afghanistan and the first Gulf War, there was Security Council authorization. And in the case of the first Gulf War, that was a conquest, which the Security Council was urgently tried to reverse and was successful in reversing. Afghanistan, the Taliban supported al-Qaeda, and that was a self-defense justification, and then it was ratified by the Security Council. The Iraq War, in my own view, was a rank illegal war. There was a justification given by the United States, which was, in my own view, kind of laughable. It was an illegal war, and I think that when you think of one of the worst things that has happened since World War II, it's the Iraq War. So there's an irony here and a sadness that the United States, which was so pivotal in constructing the Kellogg-Briand Pact and then the United Nations and all the post-war international organizations that have helped to keep the peace, has in the 21st century, the 20th century, excuse me. Wow. We're in the 21st century? You may ignore everything else I have said up there. It's a shame that the 21st century, it's the United States which is undermining the thing that it helped to build.
So what changes do you see or predict will happen in the world order moving forward?
Wow.
In the 21st century.
Yeah, in the 21st century. I could give you an unbelievably good answer about the 20th century. Okay. So none of us knows, and I feel like we're at this inflection point. That is, we don't know what is happening with the international order. It could go one of 2 ways. Certainly the rhetoric of the Trump administration has been very disheartening. Take the oil. Secretary Tillerson has said that we will now, the United States military will not only fight in Syria, but we will stay in Syria. I don't know even what to say about that. What would be the legal justification for that? We fired cruise missiles last April after a chemical weapons attack, which was blatantly illegal, and in fact, the government is not even trying to justify it. It has withdrawn from TPP. It's trying to withdraw from NAFTA. It had threatened to withdraw from NATO. All these things are extremely worrying. On the other hand, and then we have the rise of nationalism in Europe, we have Brexit, we have the rise of right-wing populism, and then China is growing by leaps and bounds, and it's not clear what kind of rules it wants. We're not doing anything to stop its expansion in the South China Sea. Since we withdrew from TPP, the rest of the world moved on and created its own TPP without the United States, and therefore any type of labor or environmental regulation that we wanted to put in we had no influence over. I don't know. Really, things depend on the midterm elections. They depend on Robert Mueller. They depend on the immigration crisis in Europe. I wish I knew. One thing I do know is that if you're complacent about it, I would like to have what you're having. Because I'm very worried.
As a follow-up to that, it's apparent to all of us the scope of what you're writing about can be huge, tremendous. As an author, how did you come to a decision point or realization that you would limit your book to less than 5,000 pages?
Yeah, well, we used like an age-old theoretical metric, which was the publisher said no more than 150,000 words. So that was the principal decision that we made. There was so much that was left on the cutting room floor. And in fact, I mean, it's too bad my colleague here, Ona Hathaway, is not here because she's much more articulate than I am. But we had such a good relationship that we would write something, give it to the other person, and they would just edit it ruthlessly. And she had a chapter on Yalta and Dumbarton Oaks, right? I put the cursor at the beginning, and I went in 10,000 words, and I put it at the end, and I hit delete, just because we had to eliminate 50,000 words. So the thing is, it's a paradox in writing. Less is more. And you have to make hard choices. And it's great when we had a great editor, and the editor said 150,000 words, and the manuscript is 150,310 words. I mean, we're also lawyers, so like, that's what they said. We got to give it to them, which I'm sure he just picked that number out of a hat. So that's what happened. But it was an enormous thing because basically we start with in 1603 with Hugo Grotius and him defending his cousin who was a pirate. And through the course of defending his cousin, the pirate, developed the classical laws of the Old World Order, and we ended up with ISIS. So we went from Grotius to ISIS. So there was a lot of stuff that we covered, but a lot of stuff we didn't. And so yeah.
This is sort of two parts, but what about Vietnam? Have we ever been sanctioned for anything? Yeah. And if you want to be an activist now, which I do you have any suggestions about how to do that?
Oh dear, yeah. So let's just first of all point out that we lost Vietnam, right? So that was like a big, that was a big sanction in and of itself. Vietnam and Korea, we talk about this in the book, are really tricky cases. They're really tricky cases because both in Vietnam and Korea, what had happened was there was a vacuum created after World War II when the Japanese withdrew from these regions and left no sovereign in its place. They created, if you will, a legal black hole. And really, the Korean and Vietnam War was a war over who was the new sovereign, because there was no way to establish who the new sovereign was, because the sovereign, the Japanese, just left, and it was like an abandoned house where nobody had title. Now, from a strategic point of view, it was a foolish thing. From a humanitarian point of view, it was a foolish thing that the United States engaged in this activity. As an activist, I will tell you that the state of the anti-war movement in this country is not healthy. There are many organizations, and we've worked with them, I love them. They are courageous, but they are underpopulated, underfunded, and there are lots of reasons for that. One of the organizations that we write about in the book, WILP, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, they still exist today. We've spoken to them. They're an amazing organization. There are all these organizations to work with, but if we want to be really honest here, you know, the midterms, like as a short-term goal and as a longer-term goal, to care, you know, both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, are addicted to war. And that's the sad truth. The book is a nonpartisan book. It's not a pox on the Republicans' house, because the Democrats are, I don't know, as bad, but are pretty bad in this respect. And, you know, as activists, we ought to be out there pointing out the real damage that the forever wars are creating to the world, to our domestic politics, to humanity.
Last one.
Is there any academic legal research going on now toward a new Kellogg-Briand Pact?
Oh, yeah. One of the organizations which I greatly admire, World Without War, run by the great David Swanson, he's been trying to get other countries to adopt the Kellogg-Briand Pact. There have been attempts to get states to adopt the Kellogg-Briand Pact, that is like, you know, like states in the United States. My own thought is we don't need something new. We just need to pay attention to the thing we already have. Because what is happening now is we are overturning the apple cart, which millions of people died to create, and which has made the world more prosperous and safer as a result. And the goal for the future, I think, is, of course, we want to build on what we have, but we really want to preserve what is the gift of the greatest generation. People do talk about the Kellogg-Briand Pact for cyber war, and that's something I'm working on. But in terms of other things, no.
Thank you. Don't forget the yellow buckets as you go out. If you have any extra jewelry, car keys, extra pocket change you want to throw in there, that'd be great. Thank you. Very good. Well done.
Thank you. That was fun.
I didn't know I was so interested in